Do you want to go from this to this? Well, stick around because in this video, I'm going to share 5 tips on how to not suck at flying FPV in 2025. Hey everyone, my name is Phil Joya and I've been flying drones for about 10 years now. My first drone was the DJI Mavic, which thinking back to my first few flights was incredibly easy to set up. With just a couple clicks of a button, I was in the air in no time, and with no prior flight experience, I was flying around and most importantly, not crashing. About 4 years ago, I was browsing YouTube for some drone content, and I came across a video by Ellis Van Janssen. The opening scene was a drone shot soaring through the jungles of Venezuela. But it wasn't a traditional drone shot. Instead, the shots were so much more dynamic and much faster than any drone that I had previously flown. And I remember thinking to myself, "That's awesome!" And from that moment, I was hooked. I also thought to myself, I have plenty of experience flying drones, so learning how to fly FPV drones has to be pretty similar, right? Well, I was wrong. And if you're watching this video, there's a good chance that you're in a similar situation that I was a few years ago. So my goal of this video is to take the lessons I've learned over the past few years and to distill it down into 5 simple tips to get you in the air flying FPV in the quickest and most efficient way possible. So let's get started. Tip number 1 is to consume FPV content. Congratulations, if you're watching this video, you're already doing step number 1. But more specifically, when I say consume FPV content, there are 2 people that I would recommend watching and reading that have really helped me immensely along my FPV journey. And those 2 people are Joshua Bardwell and Oscar Liang. And if you listen closely, that's the sound of everyone who's watching this video turning it off and going over to check out those other 2 dudes. But for those of you that are still here, here's what you can expect to learn from JB and Oscar. Now, JB has everything you need that's very clearly laid out in step-by-step guides for really every skill level. What I particularly like about Josh's channel is that he creates playlists for various topics. Each playlist is clearly labeled, so if I want to learn about how to set up my TBS Tango remote, for example, I go to his playlists, look for TBS Crossfire, and wouldn't you know, there are 20 videos in this playlist that contain everything you need to know about this particular radio link. So JB is effectively going to be everything you need in video format. But let's say you're out in the field and you're flying around and you're looking to troubleshoot a particular issue. You remember Josh had a video on that, but you forget exactly what the video was or where in the video it was. This is where Oscar comes in. Oscar is essentially Josh Bardwell, but in written form. And he can be extremely helpful for when you are trying to troubleshoot those issues on the fly. For example, if you're trying to figure out why your brand new $300 TBS Tango 2 Pro remote is fail-safing at 50 feet away, I can quickly Google search Oscar Liang TBS Tango, click on one of his blogs, and look for the word failsafe. And the second mention of failsafe says to be sure to check your region for the correct frequency bands. Now I'm flying in the US, but when I received my remote, it was pre-selected to the frequency of 868 megahertz. With a simple click, switching over to 915 megahertz for the appropriate region, my $300 remote was now acting like a $300 remote. Now I'll put the links to Josh's channel and Oscar's blogs in the video description below, but I'd recommend starting out with watching and reading some of this content, as it will get you familiar with some of the terminology used in FPV, and that will be very helpful for step number 2, which is practice in the simulator. Why are we practicing in the simulator and not just going out and flying drones in real life? It is a whole lot more efficient and practical to practice in a simulator because even if you have prior drone experience like I did, you are going to crash so much your first few flights. I think my first 3 flights, I was in the air a total of 10 seconds or less. My first flight, I crashed and I broke my VTX antenna, which luckily was a pretty inexpensive and easy fix. My second flight when I cracked my prop guards, which using a little duct tape and super glue, that fixed the problem. But I wasn't so lucky my third flight. My third flight when I crashed, I actually broke my DJI O3 air unit, which the cost of that is essentially half of the drone.
I am never gonna financially recover from this.
And at that point in time, it was time for me to check my ego and say, okay, even though I have prior drone experience, it's very clear, I have no idea how to fly an FPV drone. So don't be like me, just start by downloading a simulator because in the long run, it will save you a ton of time and money. Now there are a few different simulators you can choose from. For me personally, I've used Liftoff and Tripe FPV. I believe Liftoff costs $20 and Tripe FPV is $17. Whichever simulator you choose, there are a few things I would recommend, and it all comes down to practicing practically. Don't just go in there and rip it, right? Go full throttle and start by doing all these tricks and spins and split S's and Rubik's Cubes. When you start in the simulator, practice practically, right? Practice hovering for a few seconds and then landing. Practice doing very slow movements, things like orbits, flying in a straight line, again, coming back, landing. And trust me, I know that sounds super boring, but if you don't practice landing, your first few landings will look like this. Because just like every flight, right, you're gonna take off, and if it's a successful flight, you're likely gonna land, and you want that landing to be as smooth as possible. Regardless of which simulator you end up downloading, you will need a remote controller to practice. Now there are several different radios that you can choose from, but for me, I went with the TBS Tango 2 Pro. What I really like about this is just the form factor and portability, right? I do a lot of traveling, and when I bring my FPV drones, it's already a lot of gear, so having a small remote controller like this, I find to be the most useful. Now I will say that this remote isn't necessarily the cheapest option. When I bought it, I believe it was around $300 US. And if you get into this hobby, what you will notice is that you will be spending money very quickly. And there are a few things that I would actually recommend spending money on up front, and a good remote controller is one of those things. Now I'm not sponsored by TBS, but if anyone from the TBS marketing team is watching, just putting that out there in the universe. And another tip for using your remote controller in the simulator is you can't just get a USB-C to USB-C cord for whatever reason. I learned this lesson the hard way after buying about 5 different USB-C to USB-C cords from different brands, and none of them worked. Until one day I was on a Reddit thread and I found out that you need to actually get a USB to USB-C adapter and then a USB to USB-C cord.
Why?
Why? I don't know. It was very frustrating, but it wasn't just for the TBS Tango. I also have the DJI remote, and it was the same thing. You had to have the USB to USB-C adapter and then a separate cord. Okay, you've watched and read FPV content, you've practiced in the simulator, and now you're feeling confident about flying. So tip number 3, start small. I was in the pool! Even if your goal is to fly long range, don't be that guy whose first FPV drone is a 10-inch flying lawnmower. What I would recommend is starting with something that's sub 3.5 inches. When I first got into FPV, I knew my goal was to ultimately fly long range. Surfing cliffs, diving waterfalls, summiting mountains, all of these things are more suitable for a larger quad. But even then, I decided to start small, and my first quad was the Get RC 35 V2. Now you can see that relative to the 6-inch quads, this drone is much smaller, and again, the prop guards just make it much safer. Now, whichever quad you end up getting, what I would recommend you doing is dialing back your settings in Betaflight. Now, I'm not gonna go over a Betaflight tutorial because Josh and Oscar do a great job covering how to download and install Betaflights, but for those of you that might not know, Betaflight is essentially the firmware needed to configure your flight controller, right? Think of your drone as a computer. Computers can either run Mac or Windows. Your drone runs Betaflight. Now, once you have Betaflight installed, here are the settings that I would recommend for beginners. First, I would recommend you adjust your rates. Now, actual rates are the default settings in Betaflight. So for example, a roll max rate of 720 means that your quad will rotate 720 degrees along the roll axis in 1 second. The same applies to pitch and for yaw. For me, that was way too fast to begin with. And even after several years of flying FPV, I still fly with generally slower rates for the type of flying that I do. Now it'll differ for every pilot, but generally speaking, it's not a bad idea to have slower rates to start. Now the second thing I would recommend you do is to scale down your throttle, which effectively reduces your quad's max output power. To do this, again, you go into Betaflight and you go to the PID tuning tab, and then under throttle limit, select scale and set the number to anything less than 100. If you want to have 80% of the power, just type in 80 and then save it, and that's it. Now I've changed these settings through time as I become a better pilot, but generally speaking on all my quads, I still have my throttle limit to 90% or less. And that's because very rarely will I be at 100% throttle, right? I would actually prefer to have a little bit more throttle resolution in the center of the sticks where I spend a majority of my time flying. When I do have to go to 100% throttle, it usually means I f***ed up somewhere. So now you have your quad set up in more beginner-friendly settings. So let's move on to step 4, and that is to find your spot. I would recommend starting in an open field where there's little obstacles. It's very unlikely to be super cinematic and probably footage that you're not going to want to post on Instagram or YouTube, but it will be the best way to ensure that you limit the damage that you do to your quad, and more importantly, limit the damage that you do to other property and other people. My leg! For me, I found a nearby high school. I would go there on the weekends and practice on the football field. Wherever you end up flying, again, preferably an open field, I would recommend you starting by doing those same exercises that you did in the simulator. Start off by hovering for a few seconds, landing, and then disarming. From there, move on to slow and controlled movements. What I found most beneficial about practicing on a football field is there are predefined markers to help guide your movements. For example, you can start on one side of the field, follow the boundary line to the other end zone, make a slow, controlled turn to the other boundary line, and keep following that same pattern. As you get more comfortable, challenge yourself to stay more on the target line, fly close to the ground, and slowly increasing speed. I would also recommend bringing your laptop for the first few flights, just in case you have to make adjustments on the fly. Now, if you do have to make adjustments in beta flight, I would recommend making them in very small increments. So for example, if your rates are set at 360, don't go from 360 to 1,000, right? Go from 360 to maybe 400. Also, before every flight, it's very important that you assess risks, right? Weather, obstacles, potential interference. And for this, there are two resources that I recommend. The first is UAV Forecast. Now, this is both a website and an app that you can have on your phone, so it's very useful when you're out flying in the field. But UAV Forecast breaks down the weather in your area, including wind, precipitation, geomagnetic disruption, and then tells you whether or not it's safe to fly. It also has a map function where you can see whether it's legal to fly and any restrictions to be aware of. The other resources I recommend, especially when you're scouting locations, is Google Earth. Now, this is great for getting a better understanding of your surroundings before you fly. It can help you pre-plan in case something goes wrong. Now, apart from finding an actual physical spot, there are plenty of virtual spots that I recommend. Things like Reddit's FPV, Discord, and Facebook groups, where it's great to go in and meet other pilots and ask questions. The FPV community is one of the most welcoming communities out there, so don't be afraid to ask questions and share your progress. At this point, you should feel pretty confident about flying. So my last tip isn't necessarily required to legally operate drones in the US currently, but it's my opinion that in the not too distant future, there will be some requirements of licensing needed to legally operate drones. So tip number 5 is to become FAA Part 107 certified. Now, the FAA Part 107 is a set of regulations that governs the use of small unmanned aircraft systems, SUAS for short, or drones as we know them. To fly your drone under the FAA Part 107, you must obtain your remote pilot certificate from the FAA. And again, while it's not currently required, there are just too many idiots creating not so insignificant disruptions. Now, I live in Los Angeles, and for the past few weeks, Los Angeles has been dealing with some of the worst wildfires in California's history. Now, some dumbass thought it would be a good idea to fly his drone for clout and ended up crashing into one of the planes that was actively trying to put out these fires.
The FBI is searching for whoever flew a drone that damaged a firefighting plane in Los Angeles.
And that's just not a good look for anyone in the drone community. Now, stories like that are extremely frustrating, but unfortunately not uncommon. Apart from more potential stringent regulations, the Part 107 also teaches you valuable lessons about airspace classifications, weather patterns, emergency procedures, and all of these things are designed to make you a better drone pilot. Now, the test itself is relatively straightforward. As of 2025, the test consists of 60 multiple choice questions. A passing score is 70% or above, so 42 out of 60. And you get your results right there. I use free study resources from the FAA. I'll put a link to those in the video description below. And there are also plenty of great tutorials that you can find on YouTube. And there are also plenty of practice tests that you can take online to adequately prepare you for this exam. Even if you're flying recreationally, the knowledge that you gain from the Part 107 will help set you apart from other FPV pilots, and it opens doors to fly professionally. I've worked with several brands where I've flown my FPV drone and have actually got paid to do so. That's pretty cool. And you also get this cool little card from the FAA that says you're a certified pilot. All right, that's it for today's tutorial. If you found this content helpful, please consider liking this video and supporting my channel by subscribing. as it goes a long way in helping others find this content. If you're a new pilot out there, comment below what questions you might have, and I promise I'll do my best to answer those questions. And if you're an experienced pilot, drop any comments below for tips I might have missed, or simply your favorite tip when you were learning FPV. Even though getting into FPV can feel overwhelming at first, just remember, every crash is a lesson learned. Just keep flying, and I hope one day I'll see you in the skies.